Hey, it's Saturday, folks, and that means that I am going to talk a little bit about an episode of an animated superhero television show. Today, I will be talking about Batman the Animated Series, the episode See No Evil. Before we get started here, allow me to quickly sum up what happened in this episode in case you didn't see it, or in case you did, but you may have forgotten some of the things. There's this small-time hood named Lloyd. He has basically stolen an invisibility suit, and he is using it to stalk his preteen daughter. He wants to take his daughter, his ex-wife doesn't want him anywhere near her or her daughter, and then Batman gets involved, hilarity ensues, the end. In some of my reviews for the Legion of Superheroes cartoon, I've talked about how infusing other genres into the superhero genre can allow for many different kinds of stories to be told. And from a writing perspective, that can be handy, as you would probably guess. After all, sometimes coming up with stories to tell can be hard. So having other avenues to go down in case you're having a hard time coming up with a story can be very useful. Now, I'm not sure if the people behind this show were having a hard time coming up with stories to tell. After all, they had about 50 years of Batman stories to pull from, if they were in a bind, and there were still some great Batman villains they hadn't used yet, or they had just gotten around to before this episode. So I don't think it would be safe to say they were running out of ideas, but maybe they were wanting to try something different, roughly 15 stories in, and I'd say they did a pretty great job of it. This episode feels very much like a horror movie in a lot of ways. Sure, in any given horror movie, the hero is typically very average and only just barely triumphs over the villain. And here we're dealing with Batman. And I'd say about 80% of the horror movies you're going to see, the villain is something inhumane and can't truly be vanquished. This is why Freddy and Jason have come back half a dozen times for various sequels. And the villain of this episode, Lloyd, he is just a human being when all is said and done. But his powers do seem to be a little on the super side, and even when things are explained to us and to Batman, I still come away from this thinking that he is invincible and that he will be back for the inevitable sequel, even when I know better. But really, what makes me think this is the kids' cartoon version of a horror movie is just the atmosphere. We start with a creepy disembodied voice talking to a little girl, picking up her stuffed toy, giving her jewelry. It's really creepy. And you know what's amazing? For about 2/3 of the episode, I do kinda feel sorry for Lloyd. We don't know much about him from before this episode. His ex-wife seems to think that he robbed a gas station, so he wasn't ever a stand-up guy or anything. At least this episode doesn't want us to think so. But you hear a guy say he just wants to be near his daughter, and it is kinda hard, for me at least, to not feel a little bit sorry for him. And I feel like this episode maybe anticipated that and threw us a curveball that the invisible material that he is using is toxic and it will make whoever wears it insane. Does this really make sense? No. Just like the idea that when paint is thrown on this guy, it can somehow just be evaporated and it doesn't make any kind of sense at all. But this episode really does need this so that it doesn't look like Batman is beating up some dude who misses his daughter. The episode really needs to vilify this guy, which admittedly there could have been a better way to do that. Like actually show us what he's done that his wife hates him so much for. As is, we see him robbing a jewelry store, and he's kind of an arrogant jerk when he's defeated Batman, but I can still sort of see him as a sympathetic guy who just wants to get with his daughter. He's not doing good things, that's not even in question. I feel like I'm kinda spinning my wheels here, though. Basically, I feel like the episode is maybe just trying a little too hard to make me hate this guy after giving him a somewhat sympathetic motivation for doing what he does. And kudos to this episode for actually giving the villain of this piece motivations. I feel like with the previous episode featuring Catwoman, her motivations were given, but were very muddled, and then Red Claw's motivations were completely absent, and then with other episodes, like Heart of Ice, I feel like the motivation worked, but also didn't allow for Freeze to be a viable villain in the future. So it's nice that we have a villain who has a clear-cut motivation, and I don't have to say, but... I will say it's kinda a disappointment that this episode does not really give us any of the character development. I'm not sure if this is going to be a regular thing now that we've kind of gotten far enough into this series that we're going to start seeing recurring appearances of villains, but I was thinking this episode would be like previous episodes, like Be a Clown or POV or It's Never Too Late, where Batman is kind of more in the background and another character gets the spotlight. But here we get Batman investigating this thing, but we don't really get any development of who or what he is. And fair enough, Batman is usually the rock that doesn't change in most stories about him. But then our other characters are Lloyd, who is also a rock of sorts in this episode. He refuses to change in his pursuit of his daughter. And then his ex-wife and daughter are little more than plot devices here. I'm not going to say this is a gigantic problem. It didn't really even occur to me until I began thinking about the episode long and hard for this review. But it is somewhat disappointing when you expect certain things like character progression and you don't get those things. Anyway, I feel like I've just about covered this episode. I enjoyed this episode quite a bit, and I feel like I didn't really have nearly as many problems here as I've had with some of the other episodes I've covered so far. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And next weekend, I will be covering an episode of the Legion of Superheroes cartoon. And the weekend after that, I will be hitting up another episode of this series. But before all of that, be sure to come back next week for all kinds of fun video making from this channel. And until then, I hope you guys have a great day. Catch you later.